Hi, everybody, and welcome back. Like I stated last lecture, we're going to spend this lecture going into a really deep dive into alibis and specifically the Alibi Taxonomy. And it's going to be a kind of a combination of explaining the taxonomy and also kind of the beginning of the field of alibis and alibi corroborators. And so we're going to start off with kind of a case study that really is what prompted researchers to kind of scratch their heads and say, maybe this is something we need to look into. That case is the case of Stephen Avery. Mr. Avery was exonerated in 2003 for sexual assault and attempted murder. Penny Bernstein was on a job when she was attacked. She was riding her bicycle, I believe, around Lake Michigan. She was accosted, taken into a wooded area, and beaten. Mr. Avery was placed in multiple lineups, one photo lineup and one in-person lineup, where he was identified both times. Mr. Avery maintained his innocence throughout this, and in trial actually presented 16 alibi corroborators, including family and friends, as well as a store clerk who remembers him being out with his 6-day-old twins during the time of the crime. So between these 16 alibi corroborators, his entire day was completely accounted for. However, Ms. Bernstein identified him in court and in multiple lineups, and he was convicted based off of that, which is already something that's interesting in and of itself, right? Because Mr. Avery said, look, here's all my alibis for the whole day, and we can see that that alibi evidence was not nearly as strong as an eyewitness in court saying he's the one who attacked me. So this is one of the many ways that science actually happens, which is super interesting and should be interesting to everyone who's watching this. So the 2003 exoneration piqued the interest of researchers Beth Olson here on the right and Gary Wells. Both have their PhDs in legal psychology. These were eyewitness researchers who were studying exonerations, came across this exoneration, and were absolutely shocked at the number of alibi corroborators Mr. Avery had. And they started to ask themselves, how in the world could this happen? So they decided to go to the literature, which is the main place you go in scientific research, right? Is we're going to start with what's been done out there. Possibly this question has already been answered. In examining the literature, they found that there was basically no psycholegal research on alibis or corroborators, right? So this then had them, they confronted them with a problem, right? There's no research out there on this right now. We're going to begin the literature on it. But where in the world do you start when you're beginning a whole new field? Now, of course, doctors Olson and Wells did not necessarily realize they were beginning a whole new field when they did this. But that is the question, is where do you start? So if you're creating a brand new field, where in the world do you begin? How do you start? What issues may arise as you create a new discipline or sub-discipline in the social sciences? And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Olson and Wells, I think, handled this brilliantly, but this is already, not only is research hard enough when you know where to start, there's the added complexity of no one's ever done this before, so you have to come up with something, right? So, where do you start? Well, Olson and Wells wrote the seminal and original work on alibis and corroborators in 2004, is when it was published at least. And they decided that the most important aspect of building the literature was defining the terms and outline the scope of the issue. As we talked about in the previous lecture, right, the beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms, and Olson and Wells bought into that. And so how do you do this? How do you decide to define terms? How do you outline the scope of the issue? Well, the way Olson and Wells did it was they said, let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's look to the legal system for at least an initial definition of some of these ideas. However, this is certainly more difficult than it sounds, and having a clear operational definition, as we know from our research methods lecture, is pretty difficult. So here's an example of kind of why this becomes difficult. Murder is legally defined as the unlawful killing of a human being with malice. So for scientific purposes, is this a helpful definition? Well, not really, because it's sufficiently vague and actually probably has more questions to it than it does answers, right? So the unlawful killing, so let's just start with that phrase, the unlawful killing. Presumably that means there are lawful killings, right? So now we have to define what makes a killing unlawful, right? Of a human being, okay, we could argue about what a human is, sure, but with malice. Well, what in the world does malice mean? How angry do I have to be for it to be considered malice? How intentional do I have to be for it to be considered malice? So this, as a scientific definition of murder, is not very good, even though as a legal definition, it's okay. So for Olson and Wells, we know that alibi is a defense that places the defendant at, according to the law, alibis are a defense that places the defendant at the relevant time of a crime in a different place than the scene involved and so removed therefrom as to render it impossible for one to be the guilty party. So we've already got some questions here. Number one is it's a defense. So what does that mean? And we'll talk about that. It places the defendant at the relevant time of the crime in a different place. Well, what's the relevant time? How long is that relevant time? Is that relevant time 12:06 or is that relevant time sometimes after midnight? What does that mean? In a different place. Well, how different of a place? Can I say I couldn't have killed my wife? She was killed in the bedroom. I was in the kitchen? Is that far enough removed? Can I say I was next door and so it's far enough removed? I was in a different city, so that's far enough removed? So these are some of the questions that we really have to ask ourselves when we start looking at this definition. So specifically, right, a defense. Does this mean it should only be used in court? What about during police investigations? Also, another definitional question. Are there different strengths of alibis? Is it possible that some alibis are stronger than others? For example, is a family member a weaker alibi than a stranger corroborating your alibi? Is closed-circuit television camera where someone sees you on screen in a different location, is that better than if you said, I promise I was collecting bottle caps for my bottle cap collection, and look, here are my bottle caps that I collected that day? Maybe there's differences in those strengths. Is it the defense's job to prove the alibi or the prosecution's job to negate an alibi, right? Currently, U.S. law says an alibi should be believed unless the prosecution can negate it. But does that actually happen in practice? In Stephen Avery's case, he proved his alibi, right? And it's supposed to be believed. He had 16 people say he couldn't have done it. Yet for some reason, he was convicted. So these are all empirical questions in need of answering. And as you start going through this, you can start to realize this is a humongous task. This is so daunting just to try and figure out some possible definitions for what an alibi is and how we evaluate alibis. So Olson and Wells realized that there was so much the field didn't know that they had to start somewhere. So they just said, let's make this as simple as possible. Let's make this as straightforward as possible. Let's try and define what's a good alibi, and let's try and define what's a bad alibi. All right? Easy enough. Good versus bad. But how do you find what is good and what is bad? Right? Good and bad from whose perspective? Like, what do we do with that? Well, Olson and Wells decided to use believability as a measure for alibi strength. So, and specifically believability to triers of fact. So triers of fact would be basically juries, right? How are they going to view something as good or bad? And here's what Olson and Wells said. They said a good alibi is one that is more believable, that investigators and others believe establishes the truth of the suspect's whereabouts, whereas a bad alibi is one in which triers of fact, be it law enforcement attorneys or juries, are unlikely to believe or find to be less truthful, right? And so, okay, fair enough. A good alibi is one that someone believes. A bad alibi is one that someone doesn't believe. That sounds great. Now we have a question of what in the world does believe mean, right? And I know that this probably sounds tedious and you're sitting there like rubbing your temples going, Dr. Behl, what in the world are you talking about? We're talking about what does a defense mean? We're talking about what does malice mean? What do you mean, what does believe mean? Well, there's absolute believability or relative believability, right? Absolute believability, we probably couldn't ever actually figure out. If you are with your wife out to dinner on your anniversary, your believability level is a 7.6 out of 10. We can't do that, right? So rather, there needs to be relative believability. More likely than not, this is believable. Not always, but there has to be some relative believability, right? In relation to each other. Going out to dinner with your wife for your anniversary, with that anniversary caveat to it, is probably more believable than I was sitting at home reading a book, right? And so, Olson and Wells said we need to figure out relative believability in that regard. So once the idea of believability was established as a benchmark for good versus bad alibis, the idea of corroborating evidence became a necessary variable to consider, right? Because how can you present an alibi without presenting evidence to support your alibi, right? Obviously, social contexts are very, very complicated. As I said in the previous example, if I just said I was out to dinner with my wife on April 9th, that might not be particularly believable because my wife is motivated to lie for me. And how do I remember? I mean, I go out to dinner with my wife all the time. How did I remember that night specifically I was out to dinner with her? What stood out about that night? Well, April 9th happens to be my wedding anniversary, right? With my wife, right? Obviously, we got married to each other. And so if suddenly I said it was my anniversary that night and my wife and I were out to dinner, well, that now suddenly might make that a stronger alibi than something else because, well, most people go out to dinner for their anniversaries, right? It's very reasonable that you would not skip your anniversary to go commit some sort of crime, right? And so since these social contexts are quite complicated, Olson and Wells purposely did not include a lot of these complications like crime type, like suspect characteristics, like investigator characteristics, right? Now, some people would say, well, that makes it kind of weak, right? Because if you're not including the whole complexity of the situation, you might be missing some things, right? However, this might actually hinder the creation of an alibi literature because you can't actually account for everything. And in fact, in Beth Olson's chapter for your alibi book, it quite literally, the title of it is, We Need to Start Somewhere, right? So there's this acknowledgement that this might not actually be the full all-encompassing taxonomy. This might not be the best way to do it, but we got to start somewhere and let's build on it from there. At this point, right, much like when you're building a house, it might seem like a daunting task. You need to figure out plumbing. You need to figure out electric. You need to figure out air conditioning. You need to figure out what kind of fixtures you're going to put in the house. You need to figure out furniture. You need to figure out flooring. You need to figure out whether you want crown molding or not, what flowers are going to go outside, right? But none of that matters if you don't start with laying the foundation, right? And you just got to take it one step at a time. And so Olson and Wells, and all social scientists do this, right? This is not a unique thing with alibis. This is social scientific inquiry, right? This is how social science works, is, well, we got to start somewhere. So where did Olson and Wells decide to start? Well, they decided that there are two types of corroborating evidence. There's person evidence and there's physical evidence, right? Since the level of proof is what allows one to distinguish between the strength of the alibi, Olson and Wells decided that the best way to formulate the taxonomy is to do so in this kind of factorial way, where there are different levels of evidence. However, they didn't think one factor would be viewed more believably than the other factor, right? They thought, well, there's person evidence and there's physical evidence, and they're both going to be viewed pretty similarly, and they're both going to kind of factor onto themselves as more or less believable, and therefore they created the taxonomy, as I'm going to show you in a couple slides and as we saw in the previous lecture. They decided that the major dimension on which evidence could rest or vary is on ease of fabrication, right? And this is an important thing when it comes to relative believability also, is even if it is fully true that you were at home reading a book, isn't that a really easy thing to lie about? And so the ease of fabrication is how they would determine believability, because if someone really wants to believe that you are at home reading a book, okay, fair enough. But if someone really doesn't want to believe you, it's equally as easy to not believe that as an alibi corroborator, right? Or as a corroboration, or evidence of your alibi. So this ease of fabrication could be manipulating physical evidence just as much as it could be convincing a corroborator to lie for them, right? And so just as easily as you could lie about physical evidence, or you could say, look, here's a movie ticket stub. I was at the movie. Well, that movie ticket stub doesn't tell me that you were there. It doesn't tell me that you saw the movie. All it shows is that someone purchased a ticket for that movie on a certain day, right? In much the same way that could be misled, so could person evidence, right? If I asked my mother to lie for me, she would do it in a second if it meant I wasn't going to go to prison, right? My wife probably also, right? They have a vested interest in lying for me. It would be very, very difficult for me to run up to someone on the street and say, hey, will you promise to tell the police that I was with you and I didn't commit murder? The person on the street's probably going to be like, what in the world are you talking about? Who are you? Please get away from me. You're a weirdo, right? And so they're probably not going to lie for me. And so the ease of fabrication for a stranger is a lot higher, right? And there are various kinds of physical manipulations of evidence that could also affect believability. For example, programming an email to send at a specific time, right? Saying, look, I sent an email. That's not particularly believable if it's programmed, right? So let's look back at Stephen Avery's alibi, right? Well, Stephen Avery showed a store receipt from a store that was over an hour away from where the assault took place, an hour after the assault happened. So for example, if the assault took place at noon, the receipt time was at 1 p.m. over an hour away. This means that Stephen Avery, in order to commit the crime, had to commit the assault, drive to the store, shop, and check out within that hour time frame. The police even admitted that they made the drive in 57 minutes, so it was possible for them, it must have been possible for Stephen Avery to do also. However, there's some issues with some of the details. For example, the police admitted they drove 10 miles an hour over the speed limit the entire time to get there. So already, Stephen Avery could have done it if he sped like hell, and it would have taken him 57 minutes to get there. He could have run through the store, just thrown a bunch of crap in his cart, and then checked out with that extra 3 minutes. But Stephen Avery said, I just want to remind you, I had my 5 children with me also, including 6-day-old twins. What did you think I did with them? I obviously didn't just leave them in the car because the store clerk remembered seeing them. And so I had to unpack the kids, shop with 5 kids in tow, including 2 babies. Is this actually practical? Probably not. And yet Stephen Avery was convicted. So in the same way that physical evidence can be manipulated, there's various kinds of person evidence, as we've already talked about. However, ease of fabrication refers to the willingness of the individual to lie for the suspect. And so that's where you'll see motivated versus non-motivated. That motivated is how motivated is the individual to want to lie, right? A family member would be theoretically quite willing to lie to keep someone out of trouble, as we've already talked about, like my mother or my wife. A stranger would have no such motivation. However, there could be this hybrid. Remember, what did I tell you Olson and Wells did as far as their careers? What kind of researchers were they? They were eyewitness researchers. One of the big kind of issues in eyewitness research is that eyewitnesses make mistakes, especially if they don't know the person that they're witnesses to, right? And so what if a stranger falls prey to these same mistaken issues? Sure, I'll be an alibi for that person, but I don't really know that I remember them or not. Olson and Wells were very concerned that that was going to be an issue in the alibi literature. So they came up with this non-motivated familiar other, which is a familiar enough other that they're definitely going to recognize you, but not so familiar they're willing to lie for you. So for example, if you had a regular barber, that they see you come in and they're like, oh yeah, that's, there's Josh, I always cut his hair. They're not willing to lie for me, but they're definitely not going to mistake who I am. Right? You could argue even your professors would be non-motivated familiar others, right? They know who you are, but no professor is really going to roll the dice and risk going to jail for one of their students. Obviously, I would for all of you because I love all of you dearly, but the average professor would probably not do that, right? So going back to Stephen Avery's alibi, most of his corroborators were family, including his wife. So they would be willing to lie for him. However, during a very relevant time, over an hour away, a store employee said they saw him, and they would theoretically be unwilling to lie for him. They remember the 6-day-old twins. They remember seeing him shopping around. What motivation do they have to lie for him? Is Stephen Avery such a high spender at the store that if he goes to jail, they're going to lose out on all their money? Probably not, especially with 6-day-old twins and 3 other kids, right? And so there would not be this motivation to lie. Yet, for some reason, he was convicted. So here is the alibi taxonomy, as I've shown you guys in a previous lecture, that basically Olson and Wells came up with. They said we've got person evidence here, right? We've got physical evidence up here, and with physical evidence, there's no physical evidence at all. There's easy to fabricate physical evidence. For example, the cash receipt from an ATM, the movie theater ticket stub, or there's difficult to fabricate physical evidence like closed-circuit television cameras, right? And then on person evidence, we have no person evidence. We have the motivated to lie for you familiar other, like your mother, your father, your spouse. the non-motivated stranger, zero motivation to lie for you, but they might not actually recognize you, so that's a problem. And then we have what Olson and Wells believed was the strongest, which is the non-motivated to lie for you people that are also familiar with you and therefore unlikely to make a mistake like the stranger did, the non-motivated familiar other. And as we saw in the previous lecture, this is obviously the least believable, and it kind of diagonally goes down to the most believable alibis. So you can't just throw out a theory in social sciences and say, this is my theory, I think I'm right, see y'all later, right? We need to actually empirically validate the theory in order to kind of suggest that it is a good theory, right? And empirical validity is an important step in testing all of these ideas, right? It basically means when tested using the scientific method, and this is important also, when tested using the scientific method, the theory is either falsified or verified. We never prove anything in social sciences. The only field that has proofs in it is math, but we can falsify things. So we can say empirically that thing is false. We know for a fact that's false. We never in social sciences say that thing is true because our social world is so incredibly complicated that it's impossible to say if X happens, Y will always happen in the social world. That's just not very realistic, right? Empirical validity does not mean it always causes crime, right? There's this difference between necessary versus sufficient conditions. So X equals Y. If you have 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom every time, no matter what, all day, every day, what are you going to get? Water, because that's what water is. 2 hydrogens mixed with oxygen. However, there is sufficient conditions, right? X sometimes or usually will lead to Y. So for example, if you study your notes and read the book outside of these lectures, you will more likely than not do significantly better in the class than if you didn't do those things. It's not a guarantee. I'm not promising you you're going to pass the class or get an A in the class. However, the very first thing I always ask students whenever they say, what tips do you have for your exams or what tips do you have to be successful in this class is review your notes and read the book, right? Because those are the most guaranteed ways of success in any college class. And so this is kind of the probabilistic concept of causality, right? And virtually all behavioral and social scientific theories are probabilistic, right? So this is this idea that more likely than not, or probably, you will do better, right? And so you are increasing your chances of doing better when you study. You are increasing your chances of being healthy if you work out, right? There's a lot of things that are just probabilistic, right? You're increasing your chances of cancer if you smoke, right? People will always point to things, and using the smoking example is a good one. People will say things like, well, look at Winston Churchill. He drank like a fish and smoked all day, every day, and lived to be 94 years old. So therefore, it must be okay to smoke, right? And that shows that there's a sufficient condition versus a necessary condition, right? Well, Winston Churchill's probably the exception to the rule, probably not the rule, right? And so that's where it's not an always kind of situation. And this basic idea is called soft determinism, right? It recognizes that there are various factors that influence and limit actions, but also leave room for individual choices that cannot be completely predicted. And if you think about the example of me walking down the street and my wallet falls out of my pocket, we could probably easily, within 30 seconds, come up with 4 or 5 different scenarios of what could happen if my wallet fell out of my pocket. Someone could run up to me and say, hey, you dropped your wallet. Someone could run up to my wallet and grab it and run off with it. Someone could look at it and just say, yeah, you know what? Never mind. I'm going to leave it there. He'll figure it out eventually, right? There's all sorts of different things that could happen from that one action that we cannot predict with full certainty. So this empirical validity on the taxonomy found that naive participant evaluators handled the taxonomy differently than anticipated. They did believe that friends and family would be more likely to lie. They did not, though, anticipate the possible mistakes a stranger may make, and therefore viewed the stranger as the most believable. And this could be for a variety of reasons, right? The stranger could be most believable because that non-motivated familiar other might be motivated to not have a weird conversation with you next time they see you when you come in for a haircut. They might be motivated to just kind of like not want to get involved and never see you again. And hope that you stop using their services because it's awkward that you put them in this weird position, right? But What is important here is that non-motivated familiar others were rated similarly or no differently than strangers. So even though strangers were rated as the most believable, they were not different scientifically than the non-motivated familiar other, which has caused some people to question whether or not the group is actually viewed as the same, and there's really only two groups, family and friends and strangers, and we'll talk about that different. But not different in scientific terms actually means the exact same, even if the numbers are different. And I'll kind of give you a example of that. Let's say I asked everyone, college students across America, how do you get to school every morning for your college classes? Do you walk? Do you ride in a car? Or do you ride the bus? And I'm going to show you here the data I got from that research. And this is something I pulled off the internet. I did not conduct this research myself. So here's what we got, right? So we see that scientifically, right, most people rode in the car, right? I'm not scientifically, I'm sorry, numerically, most people rode in the car, then rode the bus, and then walked, right? That's the type of transportation that we saw. However, what if riding a car and riding the bus are not statistically different? What that means empirically is actually, even though this one's around 10 and this one's around 12, what that actually means is these should be viewed as exactly the same. Even though we see clear numerical differences, it's not significantly different. So how is that possible? How is it that we got 10 here and 12 here and we're saying it's the same? It's because there is always sampling error that's present, right? There's always a little bit of a caveat whenever we do research, right? Like, we're pretty sure our results are good, but we're not 100% certain because we did not survey every possible college student. And so because of that sampling error, when they're not significantly different, we basically just say empirically they're the same. So what we found with alibi research is that the non-motivated familiar other and non-motivated strangers are basically the same. So that then begs the question, should we go ahead and just remove the non-motivated familiar others from the taxonomy? Well, Olson and Wells said, yeah, I don't really love that idea because during a study of manipulation check failures, where you basically ask people who do your study, did you notice the manipulations that we had? So for example, we might say in this study, who was the alibi corroborator? Was it a family member, a stranger, or a non-motivated familiar other? If they got that right, they would pass the manipulation check. If they got it wrong, they would fail the manipulation check. Basically, participants did find strangers more likely to make mistakes compared to, that should say, non-strangers or non-motivated familiar others, right? They found that strangers are more likely to make mistakes compared to these non-motivated familiar others, and therefore there might be something going on with that non-motivated familiar other. And here's just kind of a quick definition, right? These manipulation check and attention questions are a key part of social scientific inquiry because they help us ensure when people are actually doing a study that they're paying attention, right? One of the big criticisms of surveys is, well, what if people just Christmas tree it? Well, if you have these manipulation check and attention check questions, they can't Christmas tree it because they'll get all those questions wrong. And when they get those questions wrong, we then throw their data out from the study. And so it helps us be a little bit more confident in the results of survey research and also empirical research. But on a straight numbers scale, we see here that some have suggested perhaps we should change the taxonomy to put non-motivated familiar other in the middle and non-motivated stranger at the bottom. Something else about research that is something that happens a lot is the initial people come out and say, here's our taxonomy, here's what we proposed, we think we're solving a problem. And then other people say, well, there might be better ways to solve this problem. Let's look into those better ways. And Steve Sharman, pictured here, is one of those people. He performed, with Beth Olson, he performed a follow-up study on the taxonomy and decided to actually collect real alibis from innocent suspects in a lab for a specific time in question. So these are people we know for a fact are innocent. We know they must therefore have an alibi for a crime that they made up. So let's figure out what their alibi is and see if the taxonomy holds up. And what they discovered was that taxonomy needed to be reworked. The specific features of the physical evidence ease of fabrication had also not really been defined in the initial taxonomy. So what makes something easy to fabricate? Well, first of all, as time goes on and technology gets more sophisticated, things are harder and harder to make up in some ways, and in other ways, a whole lot easier to just kind of Photoshop and make up. But specifically, physical evidence without time and date information was stronger than evidence. Physical evidence with time and date information was stronger than evidence without time or date information. So in the example I used before, if you have a credit card receipt from the mall, that's stronger because it shows you the date, time, and your credit card being used versus someone who sits at home and says, I was reading a book, look, here's the book with the ruffled edges and the, dog ears in the corner where I folded the corners down to show that I was reading. In much the same way, Ricardo Newcamp, who's a researcher over in Europe, proposed that having knowledge evidence should be part of a taxonomy, wherein a suspect has knowledge they could only have if engaged in a different task at the time of the crime. So, for example, let's say I was driving to work, the Bridge of Lions was up when I was trying to drive to work, which is a drawbridge here in St. Augustine, and there was a fender bender right in front of the bridge, and so I was an hour late getting to work, and I was accused of doing something at work. I could say, well, no, I couldn't have done that. I was sitting in traffic because of that fender bender when the bridge was up. Well, if you go back in time and figure out, oh my gosh, there was a wreck then, and the bridge was up at that time. The only way I could know that is if I must not have been on campus during the time of the crime, right? And so there's this idea of knowledge evidence. Now, granted, some of you could be sitting there saying, well, no, that's not true. You could just look at the news for the time you committed the crime and look and see if there's something significant and have that memorized. Sure, that's a possibility, but probabilistically, a criminal is not going to take the time to do that for their alibi, right? And so there's this idea that knowledge evidence should somehow be folded into the taxonomy. Dr. Newcamp also was able to document base rate information for different types of evidence based on the time of the day, right? And so depending on where you are at a specific time of day really kind of depends on the evidence you have. Nighttime, for example, offered a whole lot less evidence than daytime. Most people might have Ring doorbells at their house, but don't have cameras inside their home, right? They might not have cameras in their bedroom and bathroom when they're doing things, right? Whereas at work, we kind of have this assumption when we're out in public that we might be on camera quite a bit, right? We might have to swipe our key card to get into the building and get into our offices or whatever. You don't do that to get into your bedroom at home, presumably, right? Weekends also offer more evidence compared to weekdays, right? And so weekends, you're out and about, you're doing things. You're going out to lunch, you're going out to breakfast, you're shopping, you're doing a bunch of stuff out in public. When I'm sitting in my office at work, even if Flagler had cameras all over the place, right? There's not one in my office making sure I'm sitting in my office working, right? And so during weekdays, it's not quite as likely I'm going to have evidence compared to weekends. So where do we go from here, right? Well, that was just the first step. All of that taken together there was just one very small piece where we're trying to lay the foundation for the whole building of a literature on alibis. What always happens with research, be it social scientific or not, is that the more questions we answer, the more questions we develop, right? So there's a few assumptions that are even present in some of this research, right? One of them is that everyone involved evaluates the alibi claim similarly. Well, do we think the suspect, the police, and the jurors are all looking at these claims the exact same way to where the taxonomy actually works for all three groups? They might, but they might not. Also, innocence may put innocence at risk. This is a common theme in wrongful conviction literature where you might say, I am innocent, I'm so confident of my innocence because I know I didn't do it, that I end up providing really weak evidence to support my claims. For example, like I've talked about before, the guy who was collecting bottle caps, or I went for a run in the woods, I can go home and bring back my shoes and show you that there's mud on my shoes. Well, great. What in the world does that tell us other than you got muddy shoes, right? I don't know if you all recall when Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh was going through his confirmation hearings, there were allegations that he sexually assaulted somebody, and he presented his calendars to the Senate to say, look, I don't have a party on that calendar, and I kept a very detailed calendar even as a young man. To conservatives who were supporting his nomination, that was strong alibi evidence. To liberals who were very much against his nomination, That was very weak evidence, right? But that innocence, Justice Kavanaugh said, I'm confident that this will show that I'm innocent. And it was a calendar that very clearly could have been fabricated, right? There's also quality of evidence based on perceptions, right? A skilled attorney might be able to actually develop strategies to change your perception on weak or strong evidence in order to make it more or less believable to either law enforcement or to a jury. The point is, all of this takes a tremendous amount of time, right, to develop, and we're just at the beginning. I want to remind you that 2004 is when the first article was ever written. To put that in perspective, I was 16 years old in 2004. So the field of alibi corroborators is literally younger than I am alive, right? And I'm 34 years old. And so that just goes to show you how incredibly new this field is, and therefore how little we know. So as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them down below, and I look forward to talking to you guys soon.